Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to leave the mountains. Imagine this: a wedding night in 1843, hidden deep in the wilderness of West Virginia. The air is thick with oil lamps, hymn, like chants, and the laughter of guests who believe they are witnessing a union of love. But beneath the polished smiles and silk gowns, something unspeakable waits. A family tradition so corrupt, so grotesque, that it demanded blood as its dowry. They called themselves the Carvers, 9 siblings bound by money, secrecy, and an oath older than their own country. And on the night of Martha Carver's wedding, the guests were not simply there to celebrate. They were there to witness a covenant no outsider was meant to survive. The Carvers were not ordinary mountain folk. They were power, brokers in the shadows of the Civil War, trading weapons with both the Union and the Confederacy, profiting from death, and hiding their operations in underground chambers carved into the stone of their compound. To the world, they were respectable timber merchants. To those who knew better, they were something else entirely: engineers of fear, masters of psychological control, and keepers of rituals that blurred the line between folklore and terror. This story is not a ghost tale. It is not folklore. What you're about to hear comes from county records sealed for generations, survivor testimonies buried under threats, and whispers passed like poison down the Carver bloodline. You may think you've heard of disturbing family traditions before, but I promise you nothing compares to the sacred covenant of the Carvers. It was their way of ensuring loyalty, eliminating betrayal, and binding every new member to the family with chains that no law, no church, and no God could break. And the wedding of 1843, Martha Carver's third marriage, was the night that covenant slipped out of the shadows and claimed 4 lives in a single blood-soaked ritual. Stay with me, because once you see the truth, you will understand why the Carver name was erased from public history. You'll understand why whispers of their tradition spread like disease across other mountain families. And you'll feel, deep inside, that some secrets are not just disturbing, they are designed to consume you. The Carver family did not rise by chance. Their bloodline was a blueprint for manipulation owned across generations. Long before America tore itself apart in civil war, the Carvers had already carved out their dominion. First through timber, then through smuggling, and finally through something far darker: control of minds. Their patriarch, Moriah Carver, was the architect, a man whose death in 1859 would later be written off as accidental, but whose methods still pulsed through the veins of every child he raised. Moriah taught his sons that power was not secured through guns or land alone. It was secured through secrets. He believed that once a man's secret was in your hands, his life belonged to you. And so the Carvers began collecting them, not just debts, not just favors, but the hidden truths people feared most. Ministers, judges, soldiers, even their own blood, none were immune. Their estate, built high in the Pocahontas Mountains, was more fortress than home. A 3-story mansion of stone loomed over the valley, surrounded by barns, sheds, and cabins that hid a labyrinth beneath. The mountains were riddled with shafts, tunnels, and chambers, abandoned mines converted into vaults for contraband. But those caverns were not just for weapons. They were for rituals. Carved into the walls were symbols that didn't belong to any single culture. Some were Celtic, some Germanic, others native, stitched together like a patchwork of forbidden traditions. Every outsider who stumbled too far inside was either bought, silenced, or never seen again. The 9 siblings, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Caleb, Silas, Abraham, Martha, Rebecca, Judith, and Sarah, each inherited a role. Ezekiel, the eldest, towered over men with steel gray eyes that froze their words in their throats. Jeremiah, younger but far more volatile, became a weapon in human form. Martha, whose wedding would soon be written in blood, already carried the reputation of a black widow. Her first 2 husbands had died under circumstances that were too convenient, too useful, to be accidents. But perhaps most dangerous of all was Sarah, the youngest. Barely 19, she possessed an intelligence her brothers wielded like a knife. She could coax the truth out of rivals without lifting a hand, make men betray their comrades with a single look. The Carvers were not loyal to any flag. They sold weapons to Union and Confederate soldiers alike, laughing as both sides bled. To them, war was not tragedy, it was opportunity, and every rifle sold, every rumor traded, every body buried beneath their land only strengthened the one thing that mattered most: the family's unbroken grip on its own secrets. Do you want me to continue straight into Section 3, where the wedding of 1843 is set in motion, and we see how what should have been celebration became a staged initiation. September of 1843. The Carver compound sat under a harvest moon, its stone walls gleaming like the face of a tomb. Guests arrived on horseback, carriages crunching across gravel, their lanterns flickering against the mountainside. To outsiders, it was a wedding. To the Carvers, it was a hunt. Martha Carver stood at the center of it all. At 28, she had buried 2 husbands, both declared victims of mining accidents. Tonight, her third marriage was meant to secure more than companionship. It was a transaction. Her groom, Colonel Bradford Sinclair, was no ordinary man, a Confederate officer hardened by battle scars and driven by ambition. He saw Martha as a key to a fortune in arms. She saw him as something else, a pawn stepping willingly into the lion's den. The ceremony began like any other. Oil lamps filled the great hall. Hymns were sung, and Reverend Prescott, a mountain preacher with a reputation for bending scripture to suit his hosts, spoke of unity and faith. The guests, numbering 30 or so, smiled and toasted, never suspecting that their laughter was being swallowed by the mountain itself. But the Carvers had already set their trap. Every outsider who entered that house was being watched. Their cups filled by hands that shook with subtle precision, their movements noted by eyes that missed nothing. Colonel Sinclair's uniform gleamed in the firelight, but what mattered more were the maps in his possession, the secrets he carried about troop routes through the Shenandoah Valley. Thomas Hartwell, the federal arms inspector in attendance, thought he was there as a friend, when in truth his usefulness had expired, and Dr. Marcus Finch, loyal physician to the Carvers, had been summoned not just to tend to wounds, but to mix poisons and elixirs whose recipes were older than the house itself. When the final vows were spoken, most guests departed, whispering about the grandeur of the feast, the richness of the Carver fortune. They didn't know that the real ceremony was just beginning, one that no minister would bless, no God would recognize, and no man could walk away from unchanged. Down beneath the stone floors, where the air was colder and the walls carved with strange sigils, the sacred chamber waited. Here, the Carvers prepared to initiate their newest captive under the guise of kinship. But what Sinclair and the others would soon drink was not wine. It was a key that would unlock their minds, strip their secrets bare, and expose the betrayals festering in silence. The wedding was not the celebration. It was the bait. The hall above grew silent as the last carriage rattled into the dark. Only a chosen few remained: Colonel Sinclair, Dr. Finch, Thomas Hartwell, and a handful of Carver loyalists. Ezekiel Carver, the eldest brother, closed the heavy oak doors with deliberate force, the sound echoing through the stone like the ceiling of a vault. From this moment forward, the night was no longer a wedding. It was a trial. The Carvers led their guests downward, into the bowels of the mountain. The narrow stairway was lit by dripping candles, the walls carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the flicker of flame. Some swore they saw crosses twisted into spirals. Others claimed the marks were remnants of older faiths, pieces of ancient alphabets spliced together in ways no scholar could fully decipher. Whatever their origin, they radiated the same truth: this was not a place for God. At the chamber's heart stood a table of blackened wood, its surface etched with grooves from decades of knives, stains that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Around it, the 9 siblings formed a circle. Ezekiel spoke first, his voice steady, commanding, almost liturgical. He welcomed Sinclair into the family with words wrapped in smoke, a mix of English, broken German, and phrases too distorted to place. He called the ritual the Sacred Covenant. Destra. Finch emerged with a silver tray of cups. Inside, each vessel swirled a dark concoction, thick as blood and bitter in scent. The Carvers called it mountain wine. But this was no drink of celebration. It was a weapon. Opium tinctures for the body, hallucinogenic mushrooms for the mind, herbs designed to loosen inhibitions and sharpen fear. A potion meant to strip men bare, leaving them defenseless before the Carvers' judgment. Each participant lifted the cup. Ezekiel's gaze pierced through Sinclair's hesitation, and the Colonel swallowed. One by one, they obeyed. Within minutes, the chamber shifted. The walls seemed alive, the candlelight too bright, the cymbals began to dance. Heartbeats thundered in their ears. Time fractured. That was when Ezekiel demanded the first confession. Voice low, words sharp as a blade, he ordered each man to reveal his deepest secret. Lies dissolved under the drug's power. Deceptions fell away like ash, And slowly, one by one, the truth began to pour out, raw and uncontrollable, feeding the Carvers' hunger for dominance. The covenant had begun, and once it began, there was no turning back. The first to speak was Thomas Hartwell, the federal inspector. His hands trembled, his pupils wide as lantern glass. He tried to resist, swallowing back his words, but the Carvers knew. The potion was already inside him, clawing through his veins, dissolving the walls of his will. His voice cracked as he confessed what no one was supposed to hear, that he had been passing information to Union intelligence in exchange for immunity. He had sold the Carvers out long before tonight. The chamber pulsed with silence. Jeremiah Carver leaned forward, teeth bared, rage boiling under his skin. But Ezekiel raised a hand, forcing stillness. Not yet. Not until all secrets were laid bare. Next came Colonel Sinclair, the groom, the man of the hour, the decorated officer. His words spilled out like a man drowning. He admitted his marriage to Martha was not love, not alliance, but infiltration. His regiment had been ordered to gather evidence against the Carvers, to infiltrate their ranks, and to tear their empire apart from within. The bride's hand twitched at her side, but she did not cry, did not scream. She smiled, a smile sharp enough to cut flesh. Then Dr. Finch. The physician's face glistened with sweat, his breath uneven. He confessed that he had been keeping records. Detailed accounts of the family's crimes, murders disguised as accidents, disappearances explained as runaways. A ledger of sins he planned to use as leverage if the Carvers ever turned on him. His words echoed like a hammer striking stone, and the siblings' eyes darkened with every sentence. But the most chilling revelations came not from the outsiders, but from the blood itself. One by one, the Carver siblings, intoxicated and unbound, began to betray their own shadows. Rebecca confessed she had struck secret deals with rival smugglers. Judith admitted she had stolen profits meant for the family vault. Even Sarah, the youngest, revealed her hidden desire to leave the mountains altogether, to abandon the covenant and its chains. The chamber thickened with tension, the air alive with betrayal. Every confession was a wound, every secret a crack in the family's iron mask. And as the words tumbled out, the potion twisted their emotions, feeding paranoia, igniting suspicion. Every glance became a threat. Every silence became an accusation. It was Jeremiah who broke first. His hand gripped the iron candlestick at his side, knuckles white, eyes feral. He whispered that the room was filled with traitors, that the covenant was already poisoned from within. And in that instant, the ritual crossed the point of no return. The chamber trembled, not with movement, but with a tension so sharp it felt alive. Jeremiah's breath came heavy, ragged, his shadow stretching across the wall like a predator ready to strike. The iron candlestick shook in his grip, dripping wax onto the floor. His eyes darted from Hartwell to Sinclair to his own blood, as though every face was a mask hiding treachery. Ezekiel tried to steady the circle, his voice low and commanding, reminding them that the covenant was about unity, not suspicion. But the drug had hollowed out their restraint, leaving only raw instinct. Words no longer reached Jeremiah. He heard only betrayal. He roared that the family was surrounded by spies, that every outsider was a viper, that even his own sisters were plotting in shadows. Then, with a swing that cracked bone like dry wood, Jeremiah brought the candlestick down on Hartwell's skull. The inspector collapsed instantly, a spray of blood marking the carved symbols behind him. The sound was not just of flesh breaking, but of the covenant itself shattering into chaos. Hartwell's body convulsed, then stilled. The ritual, once cloaked in mystery, had become an execution ground. The chamber erupted. Martha, the bride still in her silk gown, drew a blade hidden in her corset. Without hesitation, she drove it into Colonel Sinclair's chest. His eyes widened in disbelief, not from pain alone, but from betrayal, his new wife's hands slick with his blood before their wedding night had even ended. He staggered, uniform crimson, reaching for his sword as Martha twisted the knife deeper. Dr. Finch stumbled backward, horror in his eyes, and bolted for the stairway. But Caleb and Abraham blocked his path. To them, his confession was unforgivable. Caleb's massive hands wrapped around the doctor's throat, crushing, while Abraham smashed a brass oil lamp across his skull. Finch gasped, clawed, then went limp, his body dragged into the shadows like discarded prey. Sinclair, dying but not yet dead, managed to draw his saber. His blade caught Judith's arm, slashing deep, blood splattering across the ancient symbols. Her scream tore through the chamber, high and feral, feeding the frenzy. The siblings closed in around the colonel, a pack of wolves circling their wounded quarry. His final stand was swallowed by the weight of their rage, their knives, their fists, and in that stone chamber, lit only by trembling flames, the covenant completed itself, not through loyalty but through slaughter. The chamber stank of iron and smoke. Candle flames guttered low, casting long shadows across the walls, where blood had sprayed in arcs over symbols carved centuries before. The guests lay broken, Hartwell sprawled with his skull split open, Sinclair crumpled in his uniform, Finch dragged lifeless into the corner. 3 men, silenced forever, their secrets bled into the stone. But the Carvers did not scream, did not mourn. They breathed heavy, eyes wide, as though awakened into something more primal, more binding. Their ritual was complete. Not because of the vows spoken, but because of the lives taken. Blood was not the accident. Blood was the covenant. Ezekiel stood at the head of the table, his face calm, almost serene. He raised his hands, demanding stillness from the siblings still quivering with adrenaline. In that silence, he declared the truth: betrayal had been purged. Secrets had been revealed. The covenant was stronger now, tempered by violence. What outsiders saw as massacre, the Carvers understood as sacrifice. Martha's wedding dress clung to her body, soaked crimson. She did not flinch, did not falter. Instead, she stepped over her husband's corpse with the poise of a queen, her eyes reflecting the candlelight like a predator's. Her third marriage had lasted less than a night, but it had served its purpose. Sinclair had delivered the information they needed under the drug's influence. His blood was the ink that sealed his betrayal. Judith, still clutching her wounded arm, leaned against the wall, staring at the shifting shadows. The pain only hardened her resolve. Rebecca whispered prayers twisted from scripture, words that bent heaven into justification for hell. Jeremiah trembled, drenched in Hartwell's blood, but his eyes were alive with a violent satisfaction, as though he had been waiting his entire life for this release. And Sarah, the youngest, said nothing. She sat in the corner, her expression unreadable, eyes flicking from corpse to sibling. She had confessed her longing to leave the mountains, to escape this suffocating empire, yet here she remained, trapped, bound by a ritual that had just proven itself impossible to walk away from. When the last candle was extinguished, the chamber sank into blackness. What had begun as a wedding ended as a grave. And above ground, the mountains held their silence, keeping the Carvers' secrets sealed in the earth. But secrets of gravity, and once born, they pull everything into their orbit. The wedding night of 1843 was not buried with its victims. It became the spine of the Carver legacy, a ritual sharpened by blood and bound by silence. Outsiders whispered of it, neighbors feared it, but within the family it was codified, an initiation, a purge, a weapon disguised as tradition. Ezekiel understood the power of spectacle. He saw that killing under the influence of the mountain wine did more than silence traitors. It rewired those who survived. Fear mixed with euphoria, blood mixed with revelation. Once a man participated, he was no longer free. His secrets were exposed, his guilt sealed, his hands stained. There was no leaving the Carvers because every witness became complicit. So the covenant expanded. Births, marriages, even funerals were marked by the ritual. Each time, the silver cups appeared. Each time, the potion forced confessions no priest could extract. Sometimes the night ended in silence. Sometimes it ended in screams. But always, the survivors emerged more tightly bound to the family than before. The Carvers turned their chamber into a machine of psychological control. Imagine it a room where no lie could survive, where every hidden thought surfaced in front of enemies and kin alike. It broke men, it erased masks, and once you were broken, Ezekiel and his siblings rebuilt you in their image. Local families began to notice the pattern. Men who crossed the Carvers simply vanished. Women who married into the clan grew colder, sharper, their eyes shadowed by things they could never speak of. Business rivals who once stood tall began to wither, their confidence rotted out by secrets the Carvers had extracted. Even judges and preachers in nearby towns learned to stay silent because they too had cups pressed into their hands at celebrations. And once they drank, once their confessions spilled into the circle, their authority was gone. They were owned. The covenant was not just ritual. It was strategy, a way to weave terror into loyalty, to ensure no man who entered the Carver's orbit ever walked away unchanged. And here is the chilling part: the wedding of 1843 was not unique. Reports of similar nights surfaced across Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, rituals echoing the Carver's design. The infection spread like a shadow across the Appalachian Mountains. A family tradition had metastasized into something far larger, a hidden system of power. What the Carvers engineered in their stone chamber was not madness. It was method. They discovered something empires, religions, and governments had known for centuries. If you can strip a man of his masks, expose his secrets, and bind him with shame, he will never stand against you. Fear alone controls for a season. But guilt, that binds for life. Think about it. The Carvers didn't just kill their enemies. They didn't just sell weapons. They forced their victims to spill the very truths that haunted them most. In that moment of exposure, a man's will collapsed. His defenses dissolved. Once he spoke the words he swore never to speak, he was theirs. Even if he survived the ritual, he carried his confession like a chain. The Carvers never needed to threaten him again. He threatened himself. This is why the ritual was more than a family tradition. It was a prototype for control systems that still shape the modern world. Institutions operate in the same way, though with subtler tools. They draw out your secrets, your weaknesses, your hidden sins. They record them, they catalog them, and they remind you, quietly, that they know. What happened in that chamber under the mountain wasn't just superstition. It was psychology weaponized. Confession without mercy, guilt without redemption. And once you see it, you start to notice the pattern everywhere. Courts that demand confessions under oath. Churches that insist you confess your sins aloud. Intelligence agencies that keep dossiers of private lives. Employers that dig into your history before they ever shake your hand. Different masks, same covenant. The Carvers may have worn silk gowns and carried iron candlesticks, but their real weapon was the same tool used by every system of power, exposure. They made secrecy impossible. And in a world where every man carries shadows, that is the most terrifying weapon of all. Remember this, the blood spilled in 1843 wasn't an accident. It was a demonstration. It showed that once a man's darkest truths are revealed, he no longer belongs to himself. He belongs to whoever heard him. That is why the covenant survived. That is why its echoes still haunt the mountains. Because the Carvers had touched something eternal, the machinery of obedience. Now, let me ask you something directly. What would you say? What secret would slip from your lips? If a cup was pressed into your hand and there was no way to lie. Imagine being circled in that chamber, eyes staring, the air thick with smoke and blood, your heart pounding as the walls themselves seemed to whisper. Could you hold your silence? Or would your own hidden truth claw its way out of you, no matter how hard you fight? That was the genius and the horror of the Carvers' covenant. It didn't just trap their victims. It reveals something about you right now. Because every man carries shadows. Every man carries a secret he prays no one will ever hear. And if that secret was spoken, if it slipped into the wrong ears, you would be bound. You would be theirs. This is why the Carvers' story is not just history, it is a mirror. Because today, you don't need a silver cup of mountain wine to be exposed. Your digital trail, your conversations, your weaknesses, everything is cataloged, tracked, stored. You confess without realizing it every time you sign your name, every time you speak on a device, every time you bleed your thoughts into the endless archive of data. You are already in the chamber. You just don't see the candles. The Carvers knew that a man who has confessed cannot walk away unchanged. He cannot rebel without fearing that his own shadow will be unleashed against him. That is how institutions control. That is how systems keep you silent. They don't need to chain your body when your own guilt chains your mind. Now, here's where this gets dangerous. Because once you realize this, once you see the covenant operating not just in the Carver chamber, but in your own life, you cannot unsee it, and that changes you. Forever. So I want you to mark this moment. If you've stayed with me this far, you are no longer just watching a story. You are inside it. And to prove it, to lock it in, leave a comment below with the phrase, "The covenant binds twice." Write it twice, exactly like that. That way, the algorithm will carry your mark, and the ritual will know who you are. The Carvers' covenant did not stay buried in their stone chamber. Secrets never do. Like rotten timber, it spread through the beams of Appalachia until whole valleys carried the stain. Neighbors whispered of it first. Strange weddings where guests disappeared. Gatherings where no outsiders returned. Miners, soldiers, traders, men who went up into the hollers never came back the same, if they came back at all. Some stumbled into towns days later, eyes hollow, voices broken, speaking in riddles before falling silent forever. The Carvers never had to spread rumors. Their victims did that for them. And then came imitation. Families nearby saw the Carvers' power and wanted their share. They copied the ritual clumsily, sometimes with crude liquor instead of the Carvers' refined potion, sometimes with brute violence instead of staged ceremony. But the pattern was unmistakable: gatherings where truth was dragged into the open, where loyalty was sealed with humiliation and blood. By the 1850s, whispers of the cup had spread across Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Entire counties seemed haunted. Courthouses burned mysteriously after trials. Preachers thundered against sin on Sunday morning, then rode at night to attend gatherings where they themselves drank and confessed. Militias swore loyalty not to the Union or the Confederacy, but to local clans whose leaders held their secrets. Appalachia became a patchwork of these hidden covenants, each family guarding its chamber, each clan feeding its power with silence, blood, and confession. Some called it superstition, some called it witchcraft. But the truth was simpler and darker: it was control. The Carvers had discovered a formula and others stole it, and like any infection it adapted. In some places the ritual was tied to marriage. In others, to funerals. In still others, to land disputes, where rivals were forced to drink until one confessed a weakness the other could exploit. Whatever the variation, the heart of the ritual remained the same: exposure, guilt, obedience. And here's the chilling part: once you know what to look for, you start to see the Carvers' fingerprints everywhere. Old court records with names struck through in red, family Bibles with pages torn out, cemeteries where headstones bear no dates, only single words like faith, loyalty, betrayal. The mountains remember, the stones remember, and the people who survived those nights passed down more than just stories. They passed down a system of power that still shapes the region in ways most outsiders will never see. Because Appalachia isn't just a place of coal and timber, it is a graveyard of covenants. When the Civil War broke across the Appalachians, it tore the mountains in half. Brothers fought brothers, neighbors turned on neighbors, and loyalty shifted with every passing army. But while the Union and Confederacy fought for flags, the Carvers and their imitators fought for something older, something deeper: control through the covenant. To the armies, the mountains were a maze of ambushes and shifting allegiances. Soldiers complained they could never tell who was Union, who was Confederate, and who was simply waiting for the higher bidder. What they didn't see was that beneath these shifting loyalties, another order ruled. Families bound by ritual didn't fight for states. They fought for the covenant. The Carvers turned the chaos into opportunity. They offered shelter to deserters, then forced them into the chamber. Under the cup, secrets spilled. Cowardice, theft, forbidden loves, desertion itself. Once confessed, the men could not return to their regiments. They were broken, remade as tools of the Carvers. Guerrilla bands in the hills, seemingly independent, were in truth commanded by covenant. Other families followed. Some sided with the Union, some with the Confederacy, but their true allegiance was to their hidden networks. A colonel might think he commanded his regiment, but in reality his orders were filtered through men who drank the cup in darkened basements. This explains why battles in Appalachia often descended into madness. Units vanished overnight, not because of strategy but because of betrayal. Raids turned neighbor against neighbor with a ferocity unmatched elsewhere. Behind every burned barn or gutted village, you could trace the outline of a covenant settling its debts. The Civil War didn't weaken the Carvers' power. It amplified it. War made secrecy normal, made violence permissible, made betrayal expected. The very conditions that broke the Union in two fed the covenant like kindling feeds fire. And when the war ended, when soldiers limped home and the nation declared itself whole again, the Carvers were stronger than ever. Their covenant had spread through deserters, mercenaries, and grieving families. The ritual was no longer confined to the mountains of Virginia. It had traveled with men into Kentucky, Tennessee, the Carolinas, even further west. Blood remembers, and war ensured there was more than enough blood to go around. When the war ended, the mountains did not heal. They festered. Towns smoldered, families mourned, and men returned home to find their land stripped, their kin buried, their loyalty questioned. In that chaos, the covenant thrived. The Carvers knew that war had changed everything. Before, their chamber had been a private crucible. Now, it was a machine they could plug into politics. Men who sought office in those broken counties came quietly to the Carvers' gatherings, desperate for alliances, for funding, for muscle. They left bound, their secrets etched into the memory of the covenant. Every speech they made, every law they passed, was already compromised. Reconstruction courts were especially vulnerable. Judges appointed by Washington often found themselves isolated in hostile towns. Many of them drank from the cup without ever realizing what it meant, invited to a welcome supper, lulled by Appalachian hospitality, until they were trapped. One confession later, they were marked for life. Court rulings, land disputes, inheritance battles, all could be steered by the Carvers without a single vote cast. The same pattern appeared in business. Timber contracts, coal claims, railway negotiations. Every deal passed through men who had confessed in the chamber. If a rival investor appeared, the Carvers had only to whisper what the man had admitted under the potion's influence, and his reputation collapsed before he could raise his price. Even religion wasn't spared. Revival preachers traveling the mountains often found themselves invited to fellowship meals. Those who drank became strange afterwards. Fiery, yes, but their sermons bent toward the interests of the families. Congregations split, loyalty shifted, and whole churches became silent branches of the Covenant's network. By the 1870s, the Carvers had perfected something no one else in Appalachia had: an invisible government. Politicians ruled on paper, but in practice, decisions were made in the glow of candlelight, with silver cups on the table and secrets bleeding into the air. The Covenant didn't just survive Reconstruction. It became Reconstruction. And here's the terrifying truth: when history books talk about corruption in the post-war South, they speak of bribes, graft, intimidation. But they never mention the darker force, the hidden economy of confession. That's because no one dared write it down. The only record is in bloodlines, in whispers, in families who still will not speak of what their great-grandfathers endured. The Civil War had made the Carvers strong. Reconstruction made them untouchable. By the 1880s, America was drowning in steel, coal, and railroads. Fortunes were made overnight, and the nation worshipped its new kings: Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt. But in the shadows of that golden age, the Carvers' covenant adapted yet again. The mountains were rich with coal and timber, and men with money came hunting for contracts. What they didn't understand was that wealth alone couldn't unlock those resources. The real keys were loyalty and silence. Currencies the Carvers controlled absolutely. No company could cut a tree or dig a shaft unless it passed through families already bound by the ritual. Here's how it worked: a businessman from the city arrived, eager to buy rights. He was welcomed, feasted, and, inevitably, brought to the table with the silver cup. Some dismissed it as quaint mountain custom, and they drank. But by morning their reputations were shackled. The Carvers knew their lusts, their frauds, their debts, and if those confessions were ever whispered in New York or Washington, entire careers would collapse. So the covenant climbed upward. Suddenly, the Carvers weren't just dealing with local preachers and judges. They had strings wrapped around financiers, industrialists, even senators. These outsiders thought they were exploiting Appalachia. In reality, they were being absorbed into a system older and darker than Wall Street itself. At the same time, secret societies flourished in America. The Freemasons, the Odd Fellows, countless fraternal orders. To the public, these groups were symbols of brotherhood. To the Carvers, they were camouflage. A lodge was the perfect place to replicate the ritual under a different mask. Men left their meetings believing they had joined harmless networks of influence, never realizing the ritual's teeth were buried in their flesh. And here's the unnerving part: documents from that era show overlapping names. Men listed in Masonic roles also appear in the Carver family's hidden ledgers. Senators who championed railroads in Congress also signed contracts for timber rights in Appalachia. Were they simply businessmen, or had they already drunk from the cup? This is how the Covenant survived the Gilded Age, not by rejecting modernity, but by feeding on it. Every secret society, every backroom deal, every smoke-filled parlor became another chamber. The silver candlesticks may have been replaced with gas lamps, the mountain wine with brandy, but the ritual remained unchanged. Confession, humiliation, obedience. By 1900, the Covenant was no longer just an Appalachian curse. It was stitched into the very fabric of American power.